Welcome to Rose Talk, where we discuss a variety of issues relating to international politics and security. This series aims to facilitate discussions to better understand the developments and their implications, as well as what could or should be done. As always, I'm your host, Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi, Project Assistant Professor at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology of the University of Tokyo and Executive Director at ROLES. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Lamont, Assistant Dean of E-Track Programs, Associate Professor of International Relations at the Institute for International Strategy in Tokyo International University. Professor Lamont specializes in transnational justice, human rights, and democratic transitions, and also civil aviation security. Chris is also the author of many books, articles, and many others. And his most recent work is this, Research Methods in International Relations. It's the second edition. It's a great book. I wish I had it when I was a student back in undergraduate and also graduate. And so first of all, Chris, thank you very much, and congratulations on your recent publication.
Well, thank you, Ryo, for that very kind introduction, and also for mentioning the second edition of that book. And I am really glad to hear that you found it helpful, and for others who might find it useful as well. It's a pleasure to be here today, despite everything that's going on in the world, to talk to you about aviation security. And you mentioned it's one of the topics that I've worked on. And just to provide a little bit of context for those who are listening, my interest comes from like two different directions. And one is that I worked on kind of air defense identification zones and wrote on that back in kind of doing research 2013, 2014, and have an article out in the Journal of Air and Space Law on that. And also more recently, the significance and use of airports during the conflict in Libya. And so those are kind of two kind of points of departure, but I'm here to talk today more broadly about aviation security. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and you and I have talked a lot about civil aviation security over the years that we've known one another. And just as an note, Chris is also a member of the Indo-Pacific Transport Security working group that is in ROLES. And we've always had some great discussions about what needs to be done regarding better protection of transport systems. And so today we're going to talk about civil aviation security, which simply put, and we can play around with the definition here a little bit, is really the protection and prevention of civilian aircraft and infrastructures from intentional harm and exploitation. With civil aviation, however, as we'll gather from our conversation, is extremely complex, not just in technical terms, but also in the legal and political terms. And moreover, civil aviation security is often affected by geopolitical issues, as we'll hear, as well as differences between states in the capacity and also will in adhering to international standards and norms. So Chris, let's get right into it. So civil aviation security, a lot of it, once again, is about these laws, regulations, and various other kinds of regimes that are in place to protect, civil aviation. And a lot of it comes from the fact that, in many ways, we can say that these international laws and regulations and standards and so forth are at the forefront or at the front line of protecting civil aviation because, technically, there are a lot of, how should I say, issues in how we can deal with accidents and incidents and so forth. That if you have an airplane flying in the air, there's actually very little that you can do if something happens up there, to the aircraft and passengers. So that's why, laws and regimes and so forth are very, very important. And so why don't you just take us through some of the key laws and regulations regarding civil aviation?
Right, it's a very good question, Ryo, and it's also very important that you point out this is an incredibly broad field, right? So you're looking at pretty much all that air traffic that's out there that's essentially non-military, right? For all sorts of different purposes, whether passenger or cargo and whatnot, and kind of the infrastructure that supports that. And this is all governed by kind of a broad field of law known as international air law or sometimes aviation law. And it's a kind of specific branch or body of law that focuses on those issues that arise or concern flight, air travel, and all the kind of related kind of legal and also kind of commercial concerns, right? So there's two kind of branches within this. One is the kind of the public side, and one is the private side, kind of regulating commerce. But today we almost take these agreements and these regimes for granted for the most part, right? We don't think about the fact that when you fly from Tokyo to Frankfurt, kind of all the different jurisdictions that you're flying over, and the kind of the lack of, or the kind of need that would kind of, you would think might have to exist in terms of, like, you're crossing all these like kind of territorial boundaries. This would be kind of, this could potentially be very unpredictable, complex, and expensive, yet it seems seamless to those who are just using these systems. And that wasn't the case, right? So from the beginning of the 20th century, when this body of law emerged, right, which coincided with when human beings began to take to the air, you had the kind of the initial kind of questions that emerged were really centered around kind of questions of territoriality, right? Because if you think about kind of the state and sovereignty, up until this point in human history, it was really something that related to kind of us on the ground. But then you started having kind of hot air aircraft, right, that could kind of fly and survey, and then the use of aircraft for like kind of military purposes, right? It didn't take long for people to begin to bring explosives with them onto aircraft, right? And so you had this need to govern this new field in which people were interacting, in which conflicts were arising. And so you had the Paris Convention, which was kind of the first real attempt to articulate some of these norms in relation to international air law. And here you had the establishment of state sovereignty extending to kind of the air above the state. But at this time, if you're thinking about kind of international travel, like travel across countries, pre-World War II aviation law really consisted of just just a patchwork of bilateral agreements that were kind of growing kind of in number as this once really small field of civil aviation began to expand. And the regime that we have with us today is one that was a product of the Second World War, and it's the Chicago Convention, right? Which kind of articulated in 1944, drafted in 1944, and it transformed the regulation of international air travel by creating kind of a single framework and an international organization for airspace governance. And there's some key principles in air law that were articulated within the Chicago Convention that are very important. And the first is this kind of concept of kind of pulling forward from the Paris Convention of national airspace, right? The territory of a sovereign state is really something that is three-dimensional, and it includes kind of the airspace above the state. Now, there's another question of how far does that go in relation to kind of where does outer space begin and kind of territorial airspace end? But that's another question. But the other really important aspect that we'll talk about more today, and it's very important for countries like Japan, as a kind of country that is that has seas surrounding it, is that of freedom of the seas being extended to airspace, right? That navigation on the surface of the high seas and flight now above the seas are free for the use of all. And this is something that's still with us today. We'll go back to this a little bit more when we start talking about things like air defense identification zones, because yes, you'll know, countries' territorial seas are not that big, right? We're not talking about exclusive economic zones, and we're not talking about continental shelves here. Like, your territorial airspace kind of goes to that border of your territorial sea. And so what the Chicago Convention did was created kind of a common set of standards also in relation to safety and navigation. And as the industry began to grow after the Second World War, you also had, as you kind of alluded to in your question, a number of related aviation security conventions, like the Tokyo Convention from 1963 that regulated criminal offenses or acts that jeopardize safety of aircraft on international flights, right? On domestic flights, this is less of a kind of issue because the jurisdictional question is more clear. Also like the Hague Convention, 1970, on the hijacking and seizure of civilian aircraft, Montreal Convention of 1971, on unlawful acts against safety of civil aviation, Montreal Protocol of 98 on acts of violence at airports, and also the Mexican Convention of 1991 on the marking of plastic explosives in particular. And also you'll notice that you'll have, often you might have come across, if you do engage in kind of, or if you, when you buy an international air ticket, you might see kind of reference to things like the Warsaw Convention of 1929, which regulates things like liability for kind of loss of baggage, injury, or death, and kind of its updated kind of regime, that of the Montreal Convention in 1999. So there's this patchwork, and also the central focus of that is the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a subsidiary body of the UN, right? This is the international organization that the Chicago Convention established. It establishes things like flight information regions. And if you're curious about what those are, you can kind of look up a world map of flight information regions, right? The world's airspace is divided. And of course, those, in the case of kind of a lot of kind of larger states, you might have one country with a whole lot of flight information regions. But also you have countries with flight information regions that extend very far out into the oceans. But this is a kind of a management or a safety regime, right? That one allows for the facilitation of civilian air traffic, and it also provides for things like navigational assistance in the provision of that in kind of this vast body of airspace that we have. So on paper, it's a centralized regime, although it doesn't really have very strong enforcement mechanisms, right? Those are left to national aviation authorities. Questions of compliance, you have all sorts of compliance records. You have countries like the US that do assessments of other countries' compliance with these international standards, and the EU as well, which does assessments of compliance across kind of the airline industry globally and has a list of prohibited airlines from flying into the European Union. So these are incredibly important for the civil aviation industry, but I'd argue also, of course, they're essential. We could not have this type of what would seem kind of pre-pandemic, in pre-pandemic times, kind of very seamless. Now we have pandemic protocols at a lot of international ports of entry, which is something else that we can talk about that has also impacted the civil aviation industry. So without going on for too long, that's kind of like a kind of snapshot, condensed snapshot of the kind of key instruments that are out there that make international civilian kind of aviation a industry that is as large as it is today, and with as many people moving around the world and able to take use or make use of it as it is today.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and I'm glad you raised that point about compliance. You know, a lot of people have criticisms towards international laws, particularly on the enforcement side of things, international organizations, and all that. The thing is, regarding things such as international civil aviation and that, of course, for states, for any state almost, it's it's in their interest to comply anyhow, right? Because it's release of there's a collateral aspect to this. The problem is, of course, how they comply to those measures, right? And I guess, like, the major question is like, well, these international regimes that you just talked about, a lot of them are quite old, and of course there are updates and amendments and so forth every now and then. But the thing is that the more we have created assets in civil aviation, that also means that there are potential vulnerabilities, right? Or not just potential, but actual vulnerabilities. Exit entry points have increased significantly. I mean, you count the number of airports around the world. Also the size of these airports. And just like this picture I have in the background, Kansai International Airport, you have a lot of other means of transport connecting to these places, whether it be railway, road, or sometimes maritime transportation. So, we have a lot of assets that we have to protect. And, the more activities going on, the more we have activities going on, that also means that there's greater vulnerability as well. And of course, there's a significant increase in flights, particularly in the last 10, 20 years with the emergence of low-cost carriers. So you've given us a really good sort of, digest of all the major regimes and laws and so forth regarding civil aviation, and we can add in things such as SARPs, right? Which is basically the standardization of practices and all that. But we are seeing some changes to the status quo. And that is something that we really have to think about. If we're looking at technologies and other kinds of vulnerabilities and threats, okay, we've seen these things, particularly post 9/11. Our mindset towards civil aviation has changed significantly. But what's happening now seems to be geopolitical issues having an impact on civil aviation to various degrees. And so, for example, China has been quite aggressive in its territorial claims in over the last 10 or so years, or if not a little bit more than that, as well as unilaterally setting ADIZs, right, air defense identification zones, which we just talked about, and that was in 2013, if I remember correctly. So, if we look at, let's take China as a case study. What are the implications on civil aviation security?
Right, this is also an important question. I think to set out the question in terms that, or perhaps like a little bit more worrying, is that the Chicago Convention is built on kind of this ethos of opening up global airspace to this civil aviation industry, right? And kind of the erring on the side of kind of freedom of navigation, right? More broadly and deeply embedding that, even though states, right, maintain the right to deny foreign aircraft entry into their own territorial airspace. But much of the world's airspace is what you would consider to be international airspace. Like mostly, a lot of that is airspace over the high seas. And you're asking about kind of the China's declaration of an East China Sea air defense identification zone, and why that triggered a lot of alarm and pushback initially after it was declared. Now, first, though, it's important to declare, sorry, to declare, but to clarify some commonly held, or dispel some commonly held myths about air defense identification zones. Now, these are not prima facie declarations of sovereignty, right? That this is not, there's no claim to sovereignty over that airspace that's inherent in these types of declarations. They're primarily a security practice. And the reason why air defense identification zones were first declared, the United States being kind of the first country that declared an air defense identification zone, was that the kind of, as you mentioned, technology was changing faster than, I guess, the legal regimes in a sense, right? That this idea of denying aircraft access to your territorial airspace provided you with a great deal of security when aircraft were slow moving, right? And could only attack you if they were above you, right? But with kind of advances in jet aircraft technology, advances in missile platforms that could be launched from these aircraft, a state could carry out a strategic air attack against you. First of all, you would, with very little to no warning, if you could only track them going kind of 12 miles off your coast. And also, they could do this potentially without ever entering your territorial airspace, right? That's something that could happen. So to cope with that, states began declaring what we know today as air defense identification zones. And these are extremely large chunks of airspace that are just essentially monitored. And in the case of the US imposed a reporting restriction on those aircraft that intend to enter kind of US airspace, right? That have a final destination within the US. But this was not denying access to other aircraft that would kind of fly through it, right? They might be going to a third state, or of course, military aircraft like Soviet military aircraft appeared quite a bit in these air defense identification zones during the Cold War and after, kind of later Russian, of course. But the U.S. can identify these aircraft in states generally can identify these aircraft in their air defense identification zones, but there's no recourse to force, right? Unless they're kind of engaged in a hostile act against you. And so a lot of times when kind of newspapers, for example, publish maps of kind of a country declaring their defense identification zone, there's a sense that that country, like in general public opinion, right, is making some sort of grandiose territorial claim. But in practice, right, you can even have countries sharing an air defense identification zone, right? You can have different countries' air forces patrolling each other's airspace and monitoring each other's airspace. Of course, that requires a high degree of trust among countries. But there's no treaty basis in international law for this when they were first declared. If you're looking at restrictions on airspace that are contained within kind of the Chicago Convention's Article 9, these kind of have the caveat kind of in territorial airspace, right? So you can like declare danger areas, restricted areas, prohibited areas within your territorial airspace, but you can't prohibit aircraft from using international airspace. Now, what makes the China air defense identification zone really interesting is that China went beyond kind of a reporting restriction just on those aircraft that were seeking to enter China, but on kind of all those civilian aircraft that were just transiting it, right? So if you're on a flight from like Tokyo to Taipei, or Tokyo to kind of anywhere in Southeast Asia, there was a question of kind of Japanese airlines then had to come in compliance with this new air defense identification zone regime. And one of the reasons why that's kind of awkward is that you already have flight information regions where civilian aircraft report their flights, or the flights are already recorded, right? You know what's going to happen, you know what it is. So there's no real reason to go beyond that. In fact, I believe like the Fukuoka FIR provides information to Japan's air self-defense forces, just so they know, right? There's no kind of need for kind of additional or separate reporting that goes beyond that. But not just China here. Other states are beginning to assert rights in relation to international airspace that are pushing back against kind of these kind of what you might consider to be kind of relatively open skies as they exist today. And one of the kind of most worrying examples of that was the 2017 air blockade that was declared by the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia against the country of Qatar in the Gulf. And initially, when these were declared, they included kind of the international airspace that was within their respective flight information regions, which amounts to a complete blockade of a state. And I mentioned as well, like, can you imagine in the case of a country like Japan, if other countries began to kind of impose discriminatory restrictions on access to FIRs over international airspace? And this is an ongoing, there's an ongoing dispute, right? So of course, as many will, or many would point out, is that the UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia backed down in relation to the international airspace portion of this relatively quickly because there's no international legal basis. The ICAO still found this as discriminatory, and this was like brought to the International Court of Justice and then kind of brought back to the ICAO, which in international law is still kind of the focal point for addressing these types of questions in the context of the Chicago Convention. But if you have kind of a hardening of borders and airspace, then there are a number of other things that we would have to be concerned about in relation to the safety of civil aviation. And that's something that hopefully we don't have to be, hopefully would not become too dramatic. But of course, even in the context of Japan's flight information region, right, you have every so often North Korean missile tests, which kind of land, right, and constitute a hazard to civil aviation in that. And if North Korea were to kind of launch a lot of these things, you've already had instances where they've come somewhat uncomfortably close to civil aviation. that would have all sorts of knock-on effects on Japan's civil aviation industry without kind of ever anything kind of affecting Japan territorially.
Yeah, yeah. And that sort of brings us to the next point, and that, Chris, you and I are old enough to remember that during the Cold War, or even into the very end of the Cold War, there was a thing called the polar air route, right? Where you fly from Japan, let's say to Europe, you had to fly via Anchorage in Alaska. And I actually did that when I moved out to the UK when I was like 5 years old. I remember that.
Yeah.
It's like, this doesn't make sense. Why are we flying through America to get over to the United Kingdom? And I remember, and the only explanation I got at that time was that, look, we just can't fly over the Soviet Union. That was the simplest answer I got. Now, are we going to go back to those kinds of years where you talked about hardening of airspace and so forth? Do you see, although it's hard to have a clear crystal ball, do you see us going back to those years where you just simply cannot fly over fairly large chunks of of the globe?
Well, hopefully not, obviously. But if countries do engage in discriminatory practices in denying certain other countries, right? You might have countries that are targeted by this. So you might have that on a limited basis. But to get to the question that was never answered for you about these air routes, right? If you go back to like the 60s, you'll see like kind of maps, civil aviation maps, and like people saying like, wouldn't it be nice, right, if you could fly from London to Tokyo and it just goes like this instead of like that, right? This was all closed. In part, that's because the Soviet Union initially was not one of the parties to the Chicago Convention when it was drafted. In fact, when I understand, they were going to send a delegation, but then they withdrew it at the last minute. And in part, it was because at the time, the Soviets had a very strong position against allowing foreign civil aircraft access to Soviet airspace, right? This was just simply not permitted in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, even from countries that were like satellite states to the Soviet Union at the very beginning of the Cold War. Didn't have that kind of access. And this only began to change within the Soviet Union in 1954, when Soviet bloc countries were able to make reciprocal agreements with the Soviet Union that would facilitate civil air service between kind of the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc countries from kind of Aeroflot non-Soviet aircraft. And so, of course, at that time, and throughout a lot of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was kind of left outside of this kind of common kind of these open skies that existed and were developing within the West. And commercial aircraft had to fly these kind of very long polar routes. It was the Soviet Union, though, did enter the Chicago Convention in 1970. But one of the challenges that the Soviet Union faced was actually compliance when it first joined. I mean, things that we kind of take for granted today, like the common kind of equipment, the common language of international air travel being like English, and also a lot of kind of basic kind of like infrastructural standards were things that the Soviet Union at the time was not able to easily comply with. The other aspect of this question is one that you might be thinking about, because of course, 1983, right? Korea Airlines Flight 007 was a civilian aircraft that was shot down by military aircraft for having accidentally wandered into Soviet airspace, and the dangers of that are posed to civilian airliners or flights that are operating close to regions of airspace where kind of aircraft of their kind of nationality are denied access. And this also relates a little bit to the air defense identification zone concerns that were mentioned earlier. Is that now international law does give the subjacent, or the state that's kind of under the airspace, state sovereignty over its airspace and the authority to deny entry to its airspace. But this should not be crudely interpreted that this is seen as a permission to use deadly force against civilian aircraft, resulting in massive loss of life. And unfortunately, in the the mid 20th century, this did happen several times, right? You had in 1955, in one instance, a El Al flight, so an Israeli airliner, was shot down with 51 people on board by a Bulgarian kind of military aircraft for having violated Bulgarian airspace. One of the questions that was raised there is kind of the assumptions they raised were, well, you gave no warning to this civilian aircraft. And of course, then you can fast forward to like 1973, when a Libyan Airlines plane kind of went over kind of what was then occupied, Israeli occupied Sinai on the way to Cairo, and was also shot down by Israeli aircraft, which made apparently no attempt to warn the aircraft or compel it to land. So these instances are concerning, and you might think more recently, of course, the downing of MH17 over eastern Ukraine a few years back, which resulted in kind of criminal indictments and I believe in absentia trial processes against those who were responsible for that. And there's nothing, when thinking about kind of, on the one hand, you have kind of all these examples that I just gave of states using force against, or kind of maybe non-state actors as well, in some instances using force against civil aviation. There's nothing in international law that allows these states to do that, right? Even if you're looking at MH17, which arguably took place over a territory where there was a recognized armed conflict, the principle of distinction still applies. You don't target civilian objects and bring them down, or if there is kind of an aircraft, you want to make sure that it is a military aircraft that's engaged in some sort of hostile act before using deadly force against it. But there are a lot of examples where states have not done that. And you can go back as well, like you think about like the examples that I gave there were civilian, but they're also military examples. If you go back to like 1946, right, just kind of right at the end of the Second World War, in the space of just 10 days, Yugoslavia, not once, but twice, shot down US military transport aircraft that had wandered into Yugoslav airspace because of to avoid bad weather. And it's kind of over kind of what is present day Slovenia. And again, this kind of helped establish the kind of the state practice of providing warning, but also the kind of the norm of providing assistance to aircraft that might be in distress, the same way you would provide assistance to a ship that is in distress, and not using force against these types of aircraft, right? And one of the things that is very concerning is that as you begin to harden these borders and as reporting restrictions become more onerous, and also remember post September 11th, fear of civilian aircraft is heightened, or has been significantly heightened, right? Like a lot of, if we think about air defense identification zones, really, one could argue these were largely obsolete in a way, at least in the context of great power or superpower conflict, because intercontinental ballistic missiles, right, they'd go into space and come back down. So that if one state was going to launch a strategic attack against another, the ADIZ was not as critical as it would have been earlier on during the Cold War. But after 9/11, of course, renewed attention was paid to air defense identification zones in the context of potential hijacked aircraft being kind of flown into territorial airspace.
Yeah. And, so far we largely looked at, operations in the actual air. But when we think about security, we have to think about, where it all starts or where it all ends, and that is at the airport. And so that brings the next question, which is about new and emerging technologies, which are vital, for all of us in our society, but can also be threats or even vulnerabilities, for us, going forward in civil aviation security. And so when we look at new and emerging technologies, how do you think these things will impact security of airlines and well, other civilian air operations. We have AI, cyber, electromagnetic spectrums, miniaturized weapons, weaponized animals. We can come up with a whole list of all these new and emerging technologies. But how do you think that those things are sort of affecting civil aviation security in the future?
Well, a lot of these actually are already impacting the aviation sector, right? That it's no longer just like a kind of a something that is a kind of over the horizon type concern, in a sense that, as you mentioned, airports are critical infrastructure for states. The number of people, the amount of cargo coming through them has necessitated the use of all sorts of emerging technologies. You already have airlines that are piloting things like kind of facial recognition technology to expedite boarding. And some of this has been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, because a lot of these technologies allow for people to go through processes that normally required encountering other humans, to kind of a process where you might have a machine kind of do a facial recognition kind of scan of you to confirm that you are who you say you are, and kind of go through kind of a more kind of automated, data-driven security process. And you see kind of a lot of these processes being kind of piloted or used in relation to kind of all sorts, like cargo transport as it's increasing, and also potentially moving kind of the airport, or making the airport bigger in a way, right? Because like you have Kansai Airport behind you, which is a nice example, because it's there, it's self-contained on this kind of man-made island, and you've got kind of train linkage from kind of pretty much anywhere in the Kansai area, right? You can get on a train in Kyoto and then be down at Kansai Airport, but it also has like kind of bus, car terminals, and even like a ferry terminal, kind of bringing people to this airport where they can kind of check in. But in some instances, right, you might begin to see the check-in process begin much earlier, right? As airlines partner with railroads, you can buy kind of combined kind of tickets, and you might kind of check in at a satellite that is kind of very far removed from the airport at some point in time. And the question of kind of like how and where you go through these different kind of security processes, what they will look like. Right now, we're all very familiar with kind of the physical infrastructure of airport security, which became very visible, increasingly visible after September 11th in particular, and also having that kind of move more into, and you'll see, like you've probably experienced with kind of different ways of kind of detecting things that are prohibited on passengers, kind of different ways of scanning, right, from kind of the old crude medical detectors to those kind of things that image the human body. But as you mentioned, while this on the one hand creates a lot of kind of opportunities, if you want to think about it that way, to have a faster and more seamless security process that would allow you to increase the numbers of people, right, making use of this infrastructure, there are also a lot of vulnerabilities, right? The digital infrastructure of this. And as things like cyber attacks become more common, kind of all sorts of kind of malware, a lot of these kind of security systems are on closed networks. They're vulnerable to potentially being disrupted, or being disrupted in a way that would not be entirely obvious to the operator, right? If this was coordinated with others. And so there's all these different concerns that are being discussed today. But also one thing that we can't really not talk about, what is the growth of the unmanned aircraft vehicle sector, right? And how that impacts civil aviation, from kind of the question of international regulation, right? You mentioned a lot of these conventions were drafted at a time where it was unthinkable that you wouldn't have a pilot, right? So you're thinking a lot about kind of responsibilities and decisions being made by a pilot, but what happens when that's not human, right? It's not even like a remote operator where you have a human kind of on the ground operating an aircraft in the air, but it's aircraft making kind of decisions on its own that impact aircraft safety. how this will impact the air cargo industry, which is probably where you'll begin to see this unveiled first, and also how states regulate these types of aircraft and allow for entry into their airspace, and also kind of the other risks that are associated with these unmanned air vehicles as they increase in number, and also they start to cross international borders, right? That's kind of where we were at the beginning of the 20th century when we were first drafting and negotiating the Paris Convention, right? Is that aircraft could fly for more than 20 or 30 meters, right? They gain that ability to cross international borders very, very quickly. And we're beginning to see this with other types of aircraft technologies today that, as you mentioned, I think at the very beginning, right, beyond the civil sector, right, can be weaponized or are being weaponized and used in conflict. And how does that then change how states approach their air defense identification zones? Does it make them more nervous about it, right? If you intercept an aircraft in Japan's air defense identification zone and it's a drone from a third-party state doing something weird in this airspace that's not too far removed from territorial airspace, like how does that affect rules of engagement? Do they change? Are they the same? Right. These are all questions that are beginning to become increasingly urgent.
Yeah, and just to interject there a little bit, you talked about how weaponization is advancing and so forth, and advancements in technologies, and that's why I mentioned AI, because that's going to be the thing that really changes drones. And drones have been around for quite some decades now. But what's really changing is that they're becoming increasingly automated, not just remote controlled. Now, you talked about sort of advances in technology, but the other thing that we can add there is greater accessibility. Buying drones ain't that difficult nowadays. AI is quite accessible. We actually interact with AI every now and then as well. When we check our inboxes or SNS or whatever. So that's also the other thing, is accessibility. And so we're not just worried about state actors, but also non-state actors. And of course, you can have a terrorist group targeting you and say, hey, look, we're going to bomb whatever. But you can also have insider threats as well. And that is also another concern. Do we have the right people working at airports or in airline companies? That's one. And also there's like non-intentional actions that can lead to greater vulnerabilities. And so this is sort of sidetracking from technology a little bit, but we can also have unintentional actions that lead to vulnerabilities, such as fatigues, mental, physical, and there are various other factors. And I guess another thing that we can quickly talk about here is, okay, we sort of have an understanding about what the vulnerabilities are, what the threats are, and the measures that we ought to take. Right? We get that, but the question is, and this sort of goes back to the first question: is we have these laws. Can we enforce these laws, and can we ensure that countries are on board? Even if they agree, the problem is that they may have capacity problems, such as developing countries. So we may be able to get things right here in Japan or in the United States, or in the advanced countries like other advanced countries like Singapore. But what about, let's say, the poorer countries? Do you see any issues there?
Yeah, you're getting into another really important topic, and that's kind of the capacity gap is growing as these emerging technologies come online, right? So compliance issues are going to become more difficult. In relation to the first question, is just like kind of, can we force countries? And that generally no, right? That these types of regimes work best when countries see it as in their self-interest to plug themselves in, right? There's all sorts of costs associated with non-compliance, right, with these types of kind of minimum safety standards, meaning that your airlines can't fly internationally, or people will be nervous, right? Or it's more expensive also for you to maintain a civil aviation industry domestically, and there are all sorts of issues that go along with that. But as you mentioned, for a lot of states, this is very difficult. And as you mentioned, things like accidents and just having an awareness of what's going on in your airspace, especially close to airports, as things like drones become more common. You've had instances where people have just kind of been playing with a toy drone and kind of put it into airspace that is dangerously close to civilian air traffic. And so we need to regulate this. And also you mentioned kind of accessibility, just not just kind of to those who might misuse things accidentally, but people who might intentionally misuse these types of platforms. You might think about just like if you see kind of recently, kind of a couple months back, there were attacks that were carried out by militias, non-state militias in Iraq using drones. You've also had the use of kind of fully autonomous loitering drones in places like Libya, right, where you don't need any kind of contact with any human operator, right? They don't need to be connected to any sort of digital network. They have kind of all that decision-making capacity kind of built in, and they go out and they look for their own targets and they figure out how to attack them. And these are all challenges that are going to affect international civil aviation on a number of levels. And as I mentioned kind of early on, the Chicago Convention provides a very nice kind of touchstone, I guess, for foundation for going forward. And some of the key principles that are built into that really are about opening up kind of the world to international civil aviation. And it's hard to imagine what that would look like if kind of the costs of civil aviation increase. We have already kind of maybe have gotten kind of a sneak peek of that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And going forward, if it remains kind of difficult to cross borders for a host of reasons, right, beyond the pandemic that you've mentioned, countries hardening borders in airspace, increased dangers to civil aviation. You'll notice kind of the map behind me of, unfortunately, Ukraine's airspace, where it is kind of devoid today of civil aircraft. As kind of these conflicts grow, not just kind of conflicts in relation to kind of armed conflicts, but conflicts in relation to disputes over and kind of making kind of claims to be able to deny access over airspace, and international airspace in particular. We'll see that a lot of our everyday lives is tied up in this industry in a way that we might not have acknowledged, right? Yeah. So beyond kind of the inconvenience of going to Anchorage, and the kind of air cargo industry is critically important to Japan's economy. Kind of what would a disruption of that result in here domestically? As I mentioned, things like kind of the firing of North Korean missiles into flight information region that is kind of administered by Japan is something that civil aviation takes into account in terms of their own risk assessments, right? It's one could end up very isolated very quickly if one is not careful about, or does not have an awareness of aviation security around them.
Yeah, and another capacity issue in a different way will be Taiwan. Because Taiwan's not even is pretty much barred from being a member by CAO and a lot of international regimes, and so there are issues like that as well. Because Taiwan, is a the economy is doing well, or has grown well, despite its size. Its transport industry is massive, right? Again, for its size, and so that's also something that we have to think about as well. And of course, and if we go back to the question about new emerging technologies, flying cars, might still be some years, but still, when that really becomes a norm, that's going to sort of bust open a whole new can of worms, right? In terms of civil aviation security. And also, when you talk to international regimes and how countries respond to them or how countries enforce them, we also, I guess, this other factor, and that is that you have states, particularly authoritarian states, that will focus more on regime security, as opposed to public safety, unlike a lot of democratic states. So I'm not saying that authoritarian states don't care about public safety, but the prioritization is very, very different from democratic states, that's for sure. And so yeah, I mean, I guess what all this means is that we need to reconfigure a lot of our laws and the way we sort of look at or treat civil aviation security. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and it's good that you brought up Taiwan here, because if we were to take Taiwan as a kind of as an example, right, that it is a territory state that is claimed, of course, by China, is barred from international organizations, and if you're like to apply principles of territorial airspace to Taiwan in this particular context, what would happen if China asserted that the right to prohibit civilian air traffic into airspace over Taiwan on the basis of territorial sovereignty? Right, that civilian airlines would not possibly take the risk of violating such a prohibition, and you could effectively blockade that territory from the air. And likewise, I mean, a softer version of that would be to kind of to deny access to, or to try to get discriminatory access to international airspace that might be administered by China as well, as opposed to airspace that is over Taiwan itself. And what this tells us is that there are a lot of really very critically important questions that need to be addressed in relation to civil aviation. There are a lot of critical risks that are out there for civil aviation. If there is a conflict, we'll probably see it here first, right, before we see it in other places. You notice that, for example, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia issued a notice to air missions prohibiting or warning civil aircraft about entering airspace over eastern Ukraine. Of course, that was very quickly expanded to the entire country of Ukraine. And at the same time, right, this is something that we all, in a way, depend on, even if we are not the ones who are making use of international air travel. And so strengthening kind of existing regimes is one thing that certainly we should do, and also strengthening and clarifying international law in relation to a lot of these emerging technologies and systems that we've talked about, such as kind of unmanned aerial vehicles, right, what commonly known as kind of like drones. Although I hesitate sometimes to say drone, because a lot of times people in kind of the public imagination, drones are often associated with like the remote, kind of essentially remote controlled vehicles, right? There's like a human controlling a drone somewhere, airspace. And as you mentioned, what we're talking about here also includes those types of aircraft that are kind of fully autonomous from a human controller.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, so there's a lot to look out to sort of watch out for in the coming years and decades in regarding civil aviation security. So from my conversation today, we can see that there's a lot to chew on and a lot to think about. And despite COVID-19, civil aviation is going to come back, and there's going to be some new types of developments, as we just discussed, with new emerging technologies, new methods of travel, and so forth. But that also means that we have to do a lot more, or do things in new ways to protect those systems. The trick, of course, is how we can better protect civil aviation in ways that take into account of geopolitical and security developments, new emerging technologies, and also new norms of travel, as we just discussed. And moreover, we need to sort of also keep in mind of how we can balance security, operations, and also rights as well, because there are going to be some sensitive questions regarding privacy, individual rights, and so forth as we sort of enhance security measures or enhance operations or whatever. So again, there's a lot that the international community, not just governments, but also operators and the public, has to do more to ensure the security of civil aviation going forward, and also other aspects of transport security overall. So Chris, as always, thank you very much for today. It's always great, chatting with you. And I look forward to working with you more on a whole range of things, but of course, civil aviation and security in the coming days and years.
Well, certainly, and thank you very much for having me as a guest. I always enjoy these discussions, and I very much look forward to working with you and with colleagues at Rolls on this topic going forward.
Okay, great, thank you. So that's it for this episode of Rolls Talk. Thank you for tuning in, and please don't forget to subscribe to our channel as there'll be more episodes coming up. So again, stay tuned, and as always, take care and thank you. Bye.